One of the most underrated decks in the game is Electromagnet Warriors. I have said previously that one of the major reasons this deck has been forgotten by so many is that it arrived at the same general time as ABCs, and ABCs pretty much just sucked all the air out of the room with its more powerful and field-controlling boss monster and its better initial first-turn tempo-driving field spell. Because over the course of 3 to 5 turns, Magnetic Field is a better field spell than Union Hanger. However, on that first turn, Union Hanger is definitely a better field spell. So ABC received all this positive attention, and the delayed release of Delta also hurt Electromagnet Warriors and their playability, and like many archetypes in the game, if it can't get its foot in the proverbial door right away and it doesn't have a lot of fan nostalgia or favoritism behind it, the deck's going to be pretty quickly forgotten in the world where Konami just keeps spitting out new archetypes over and over again. Let's see what my current Electromagnet Warrior deck looks like. Starting off with the new Magnet Warriors, I run 3 copies of Alpha, 3 copies of Beta, and 3 copies of Gamma. There are some people who only run 2 copies of Gamma, but I disagree with this mindset because the entire deck centers around getting a Magnet Warrior on the field as fast as possible to start driving the action of the deck and making Berserkion and Magnetic Field more live, especially with jumping out of the way during the opponent's turn to summon Delta. While Gamma's effect may be a little situational and its overall attack power is completely underwhelming, I feel it is necessary at 3 copies in the current meta until Konami, if they ever do, decide to make more Magnet Warriors that could possibly serve as replacements. 3 copies of Delta are also important. I used to run 2, and while I still do not like the idea of drawing a Delta, it is important to have those Deltas in the deck, summon with Alpha, Beta, and Gamma's opponent turn's effect to maximize the speed at getting Berserkion on the field as fast as possible, or utilizing the recursion ability from the deck. Finally, rounding out the direct Magnet Warrior monsters and their support, I run 2 copies of Berserkion as the Goldilocks number. 1 copy is typically too little, especially if it gets solemned on summon, and 3 copies is just too much and tends to get bricky. Berserkion can commonly either empty the opponent's field or at least hit the opponent's most important card with its effect. A lot of people look down on Berserkion because, oh, it's not quick play. Yeah, that would have been nice, but it's really not a big deal if you play smart. The nice thing about Berserkion also is the opponent should have an aversion to destroying it, because when it's destroyed, the player gets to summon an Alpha, a Beta, and a Gamma from the Banish Zone to the field, netting all of their effects if they have not been activated during the current turn, and you'll probably net at least 1 Gorgonic Guardian, depending on the field that you have at the time of that summon, and if you haven't activated Alpha's effect, you're probably just going to get your second Berserkion, and if you want, just put another Berserkion right on the field. Closing out the monsters, I run 1 copy of the not surprising Sentry of Stone, although I do not think this card is as good as a number of other people because it can be slow. If Electromagnet Warriors ever got a new magnet, I'd probably dump this card for that new magnet if it had any good qualities at all. 1 copy of Eater of Billions to remove those anti-destruction cards, as well as force the opponent to possibly overextend. 2 copies of Dokidoki, which again I'm not a big fan of, but getting those Magnet Warriors on the field because of their lack of general support as fast as possible for this deck is priority number 1, and Dokidoki does it better than pretty much any other card you can put in the deck in its place. Finally, I run 2 copies of Juragedo because it is really important for this deck to end duels on the turn that Berserkion hits the field and does its field plowing work, because as mentioned before, Berserkion does not have that quick play effect, so all your opponent has to do is make a simple Castel play and you want to cry. Juragedo offers that additional 2700 damage, which can hasten the end of the duel, along with its defensive nature. You can summon it during the opponent's battle phase to ward off damage, and the life gain capacity. For the spells, I run 3 copies of Magnetic Field, which, in my opinion, over the long haul is a better field spell than Union, where it nets multiple pluses through its recursion effect. as well as allows you to remove opponent monsters with a non-targeting bounce effect during either the opponent's turn or the player's turn, which means your opponent has to play a little smarter, a little more defensively, rather than just swarm the field and try to run all over your monsters. 1 copy of Raigeki, 1 copy of Darkhole, and 1 copy of Lightning Vortex, all for mass field clearance. The discard for Vortex is really not that bad in this deck because of Berserkion Summons condition, and you might discard it Sentry, which is actually a plus. I run 2 copies of Scapegoat, but its play needs to be managed carefully because its activation interferes with the ability of the level 3 Magnet Warriors to jump out of the way to summon Delta during the opponent's turn and dump another magnet into the graveyard, which is the entire process behind hastening the summon of Berserkion. In my experience, Scapegoat is useful when you do not draw a magnet, but not so useful when you do. With those tokens in tow, I run 2 copies of Enemy Controller, which is a fantastic tech card in a lot of decks that most people have seemingly forgotten. It's a very effective way of, let's just say, removing a high-value obstacle, in addition with link summoning around, taking your opponent's monster and never giving it back to them because you use it in a link summon is definitely something that happens much more often than not. And with this deck, you're typically going to be sacrificing a low-value card or easily retrieved card for whatever monster you're taking from your opponent. 1 copy of Foolish Burial is obviously useful for Sentry dumping and Magnet dumping to set up either Magnetic Field or Berserkion summoning. Of course, I run the now 1 allowable copy of Monster Reborn for basically stealing an opponent's monster from their graveyard or summoning another Berserkion from my own graveyard is never a bad thing. Finally, I run 1 copy of Upstart Goblin for that slightly enhanced speed. For the traps, I run 3 copies of Back to the Front, for there are a number of monsters that benefit from being revived in this deck, especially Berserkion. In the past, I almost always ran the 1 allowable copy of Torrential Tribute in almost all of my decks, so of course, I now run the 3 allowable copies of Torrential Tribute, thanks in large part to the ability of the level 3 magnets to jump out of the way, so to speak, and the 1 now allowable copy of Solemn Judgment. Another potential card is Book of Eclipse, which I side depending on the type of deck you're facing. Also, one could run the obligatory, at least in some eyes, 3 copies of Ash Blossom or insert your favorite hand trap here. I always try to run decks without hand traps because of just the sheer cost associated with fielding those cards in real life. And it's a lot easier to look at a deck without hand traps and say, I'll just take out X cards here and throw in my favorite hand trap, rather than putting hand traps in and then trying to build it backwards by just removing those hand traps, and then what would you put in their place? Some notes about a few cards I choose not to run that others may disagree with. First, while Ties of the Brethren may seem ideal for this deck due to the effects of the Magnet Warriors, I do not like the card, largely because if you do not draw ties going first on your first turn, the restrictions associated with the card make it almost impossible to win because you will consistently fall too far behind. Even when you hit it with your first turn, you do not really get much out of it. Best case scenario, you get an alpha, a beta, and a Sentry, but because of the no special summons after activation condition, you can't make Gorgonic Guardian, meaning you get a decent setup for next turn with the alpha and beta searches, but it's not really worth the bricky nature of ties, in my opinion. Second, I do not run Block Dragon anymore because the summons cost is just too much for its protection. The protection is typically not super valuable. No destruction by card effects is not overly useful for the style of decks. The little magnets can come back really easily with your recursion, and one thing you'll probably never be saying is, oh no, please don't destroy my Berserkion. Granted, there are those times where Berserkion can be destroyed and then your opponent can flop over a Solemn card negating its graveyard effect. Most of the time, that's not going to happen. Block Dragon would be amazing for this deck if Brock's ever got an effective card to return monsters from the banished zone to the graveyard, the simple fact is Pot of Acquisitiveness or Burial from a Different Dimension just doesn't get it done. Outside of some of the mandatory rank 3 selections, the extra deck is basically whatever you want with respect to link monsters that can be summoned and some rank 4s. My extra deck is 1 Tornado Dragon, 1 number 41 Baguska, 1 Castel, 1 Gagaga Cowboy, 1 Nightmare Shark, 2 Phantom Knight of Breaksword. I use Breaksword for clearing unknown backrow that may remove Berserkion without destroying it, leaving me in the lurch, or monsters that can do the same. In addition, it's also a way to effectively dump both Magnet Warriors you're using to make it into the graveyard. There's very few rank 3s that detach 2, and Breaksword does it in a roundabout way because you can target Breaksword. Breaksword destroys itself, sending those 2 magnets to the grave. 3 Gorgonic Guardians as kind of the key extra deck boss monster. 1 Borreload Dragon, 1 Skulldeep, 2 Missus Radiant, and 1 Link Spider. One thing to note about the deck strategy, at least my strategy, is to be careful about going into Gorgonic Guardian too early due to the advantage of filling the graveyard with Delta during your opponent's turn to allow you to summon Berserkion at least 1 turn earlier. Gorgonic Guardian is powerful, but Berserkion is more powerful and can do more playmaking, despite not having that quick play effect. Also, if you have to deal with a Firewall Dragon with a magnetic field and then summon Berserkion during main phase 2, feel free to do it and clear field with Berserkion's effect, for his worst enemy are those non-destruction removal cards. Overall, the new Magnet Warriors are much better than most people think they are, and due to the lack of an extra deck outside of those Gorgonic Guardians, and if you want Breakswords, are incredibly budget. Well, that is my Electromagnet Warrior deck. Thank you for your attention and your time. I'm out.